Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, Better a Witty Fool, a Critique of Presuppositionalism. In this video we're going to be doing Bertrand Russell versus Presuppositionalism. But before we get to that, we have to answer the question, who was Bertrand Russell? Well, if you don't know who Bertrand Russell was, I would highly suggest you check out his philosophies and some of the things that he did in his life. We are not going to come close to documenting everything that he did, or even talking about all of the cool things that Bertrand Russell did in his life, so I would highly suggest you check that out on your own. Bertrand Russell was one of the founders of analytic philosophy. He was also one of the most important logicians of the 20th century, and both of those are basically between him and one other person in both of those categories. He was an atheist with many powerful objections to classical arguments for God. If you've ever heard of Russell's teapot, this is the Russell of Russell's teapot. You should, if you're an atheist or you're interested in these kinds of things, check out Why I'm Not a Christian by Bertrand Russell. It's free out there online, and he offers a lot of good objections to classical arguments. He was also an anti-war and anti-nuclear activist, and he won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1950. Pretty cool guy. But don't take my word for it. There's some other important philosophers that had some cool things to say. Mr. A.J. Ayer, a good philosopher in his own right, said, "The popular conception of a philosopher as one who combines universal learning with the direction of human conduct was more nearly satisfied by Bertrand Russell than by any other philosopher of our time." Or, if you prefer Quine, "I think many of us were drawn to our profession by Russell's books. He wrote a spectrum of books for a graduated public, layman to specialist. We were beguiled by the wit and the sense of newfound clarity with respect to central traits of reality." Basically, he's a pretty cool guy. I'm not going to come close to documenting even a fraction of his work in this video, but we're going to talk about one of the things that was the most important. Principia Mathematica. Principia Mathematica was a giant project conceived by Bertrand Russell and Alfred Whitehead to defend logicism, which is the claim that all of math is reducible in some important way to logic. It was arguably one of the three most important books on logic that have ever been written, and it was huge. It was a giant volume. They supposedly had to carry it in a wheelbarrow to the printing press to get it printed. It's huge. It's very cool and very interesting. But all I'm going to be using all of Russell's fantastic theories for in this is just his basis in logic and some of his ideas of logic presented in Principia Mathematica that live on today. Check out my series on the 100 Days of Logic. If you look at the propositional logic stuff, a lot of that, if not all of it, comes from Principia Mathematica. So, with that in mind, I'm going to do a little logical proof. If you're confused by this, you should check out my videos on the 100 Days of Logic. Once again, what we're going to prove is that if L implies it's not the case that L, then it's just not the case that L. Why is this important? We'll see in a second. So, first off, assumed indirect proof, we're going to assume the negation of our conclusion, show that it leads to a contradiction, and then be able to conclude our conclusion. We'll draw a line going down. First off, we'll do implication to switch that implication sign over to a disjunction and negate the first of our disjuncts. Then we're going to use De Morgan's law. I kind of squished some double negation in there, arguably not. That's something we can argue later to get L implies it's not the case that L and L. We can then simplify that down to L and L implies it's not the case that L. Then we can get it's not the case that L, 4, 5 modus ponens. And finally, L and it's not the case that L from 4, 6 conjunction. This means that we can then conclude our original conclusion or the negation of our first assumption because we've reached a contradiction. That just is L implies it's not the case that L just implies that it's not the case that L. 1 through 7 indirect proof. Now, why am I doing this and what does this relate to presuppositionalism? Well, if we replace L with logic, we can show that if logic implies that it's not the case that logic, then it's just not the case that logic. It doesn't end up in some weird contradiction where we're not sure whether or not logic is the case. It actually just denies logic. Okay? This may seem a little confusing, so we're going to do a number more examples. But basically, if logic implies that logic is not the case, then logic's just not the case. To argue for the first half of it, that logic implies that logic isn't the case, check out my video on doubting truth, the law of the excluded middle. But first, let's get back to presuppositionalism. So, for the sake of argument, we'll go down the path of absolute truth exists because we've already exhausted the other options. We'll say I know something to be true, why not? Now we come to logic exists or logic doesn't exist. Bertrand Russell would probably actually go with logic exists, but once again, for the sake of kind of showing that every single branch of this tree is rotten, let's go with logic does not exist. Well, either logic implies that logic doesn't exist, or something arbitrary that's not logic implies that logic does not exist. Well, as we've just shown, even if logic were to imply that logic didn't exist, that would just mean that logic didn't exist, or logic wasn't the case. It would not mean that, oh, this is some weird contradiction, we have to go back to our original question. Nope. It would be something that, according to logic, is what's supposed to happen. If logic implies that logic isn't the case, then logic just isn't the case. For this to make a little more sense, let's go with a thought experiment. So, imagine that you have a diagnostic program that claims to test if other programs are working correctly or not. In order to see if the program itself is working, you're going to run the program on itself. Why not? Sounds like a great idea. The program's result is that the program is not working correctly. The question is the program working correctly or not? This might seem at first to be some interesting kind of paradox, but it's not. It cannot be working properly. If the program was working properly, it would have been forced to return that it was working. There's no way for the program to work properly, that is, the program that tests whether or not it's working properly, to work properly and then say that it's not working properly. If it said that it's not working properly, the only possibility is that it in fact is not working properly. So if logic shows that logic doesn't work, then logic has shown that logic doesn't work. And the only thing we can conclude is that logic doesn't work, even if logic doesn't work and we couldn't get to that conclusion without logic. In the same way that just because the computer program doesn't work properly may show us that the computer program doesn't work properly, so our kind of line of reasoning wouldn't work out. But it does, because the fact that the computer program doesn't work properly is the conclusion we're trying to get to. If that didn't make sense, we're going to do this in decision matrix to make more sense of it. Either the program is working or the program is broken, and either the program says it's working or the program says it's broken. Well, if the program is working and it says it's working, that's awesome. The problem is, and this is the key, if the program is working, there is no way for it to say that it's broken. If the program is working, there's no way for it to say it's broken. If the program says it's broken, the only possibility is that the program is actually broken, which would be semi-frustrating. The big problem is when the program says that it's working and then is actually broken, as many programmers will surely know. Now, either logic is correct or logic is not correct. Either logic says it's working or logic says it's broken. Well, if logic is correct and it says that it's correct, that's awesome. If logic is correct, but logic says that logic is broken, that is impossible. Because if logic would imply that it's not working, then logic is not working. Logic doesn't exist. Logic doesn't exist in an important way that it shows that reality is and can be corresponded to words that we use, which is the purpose of logic. Logic is not correct and logic says that it's broken. That's the only option we have if logic says that it's broken, which would be a little frustrating. The more frustrating thing, which we can get into with more of Gödel's incompleteness theorem, is when logic is not correct, but it says that it's working, or when there are parts of logic we can't prove with logic. Very frustrating. But that's a discussion for another time. The salient point here is that if logic says that it's broken, or logic implies that logic isn't working, then logic just isn't working. It's not an interesting contradiction, it's just that logic isn't working. So, Russell's objection, or at least the objection from logic, might be more correct. If logic implies that logic is not the case, then logic is not the case. One may coherently deny logic using logic. Once again, Russell wouldn't support premise 2. I, on the other hand, probably would. Once again, check out my video on doubting truth if you're curious. Therefore, even though Russell would not hold this position, one may deny logic using logic, as Russell has shown, without reaching a contradiction. Okay? It's important to note that Russell actually fought against these paradoxes where logic seems to devolve into contradictions. That's the idea behind kind of Russell's paradox, which you should check out, and the eventual problems that come with Gödel's incompleteness theorem and everything going on there. Check out my videos on that if you're curious. That was Bertrand Russell versus Presuppositionalism. Next up is Saul Kripke, Quine Goodman, Aristotle, Lewis Carroll, and finally, I'm going to offer a whole slew of objections to presuppositionalism that we may have missed. If you have any of your own objections to presuppositionalism, offer them in the comments and you may see them appear in that last video. Watch this video and more at Carneades.org and stay skeptical, everybody.